longer Mr. Harwell's talking.
Mr. Harwell, will you come and sit down?
As we start again,
Hello?
hello, hello. As we get started again, I first want to ask, does anyone have any questions or comments about what we've discussed so far? You'll raise your hand and we'll talk about that before we move on. Any questions or comments today? They're a bashful crowd at the moment. Let's go on and talk about, after the Ford Pinto case, there was a local case, local man, Bronson Ingram, you represented. Is that correct?
Yes, I did.
Okay, tell us a little bit about that case.
Well, I'll do it very quickly. Bronson Ingram was the head of the Ingram family here. Martha Ingram's husband. He was indicted in Chicago for many counts of alleged violation of the U.S. Travel Act. And that simply is an act that says whoever travels or uses the facilities of interstate commerce and engages in an act of racketeering. Well, racketeering is defined as bribery, and so basically Bronson and others were charged with bribing commissioners of the sanitary district in Chicago in order to get a job contract hauling sludge from the city of Chicago down the Illinois River and burying it down there in the sludge ponds. And so I went up there. It took about 11 weeks to try that case. I went to Chicago and tried it and had a not guilty of all counts, which it should have been.
Okay. After that, I guess the next case let's talk about is the state of California versus John Landis.
Yeah.
The Twilight Zone case.
Twilight Zone case.
How did you get involved in that case?
Well, of course, following the Hoffa case, I've had some notoriety. And truly, up until the last, 10 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, I was lucky to practice in an era when the big firms, say Nashville's Bass, Berry and Sims or Waller Lansden, but the big firms around the country kind of belittled criminal practice, even though it was a white-collar criminal practice. So with the big firms around the country not deigning to get themselves involved in that, there were 10 or 12 lawyers up until 15 years ago. There were 10 or 12 lawyers around the country that you'd automatically think of. And I was one of those lawyers, and I got called called by John Landis and asked if I would meet with him, and I agreed to, and Jim Sanders and I went out to California and went Hollywood.
Well, tell us a little bit about the facts of this case. What happened?
Well, in 79 or 80, I guess, John Landis, by the way, John Landis, whether you know it or not, is a famous director. He directed Animal House, Blues Brothers, Coming to America, Three Amigos. Jim and I went out to see participate in the filming of the Three Amigos while we was out there. But those kind of cases he directed. And he was directing one of the segments of the Twilight, called The Twilight Zone, the movie. What's his name? The famous director was director another one. The guy who did Schindler's List and Diane. Steven Spielberg directed another segment, and another director directed another segment. And John Landis' segment was a segment to highlight bigotry. And I won't explain all of that is, but one of the scenes was to be a scene in, simulate a scene in Vietnam, where helicopters were coming over and dropping bombs. And John found a little place out there, there's a cliff on one side and a stream running through it. And in making those movies like that, to simulate the dropping of a bomb, you use a pot of black powder, and you ignite that black powder, and a flame goes up and smoke goes up, and it looks like you dropped a bomb. So John prepared for the scene, and he had the helicopter was to come over, and then the black powder bombs, the pots with black powder were to go off to simulate bombing from the helicopter. And the scene was well designed, and you have all these people. You have stunt men, special effects men, all of that. And as the helicopter is coming over, his helicopter is supposed to get by and out of the way before the pots with the black powder are ignited. But the stunt man made a mistake here and ignited a pot of black powder right under the tail assembly of the helicopter. And that caused a delamination of the tail rudder, so that the helicopter, with nothing to counterbalance the main rotor blade, just became a twirling razor. And it dropped on and cut off the head of the actor Vic Morrow and 2 6-year-old Vietnamese children. It was a scene that was filmed by 4 or 5 different cameras. And John Landis, the stunt man, the helicopter pilot, and one other, the producer, were indicted on 3 counts of reckless homicide. And Jim and I went out there and tried it. The trial lasted almost 10 months, if you can believe it. We were fortunate again that there was money involved. Warner Brothers paid our fee, and we stayed in Beverly Hills with a van to take us down to downtown Los Angeles every day of trial. So it was not a bad setting for us, because downtown Los Angeles in some places would be a bad setting. We tried the case. It's another classic example of the prosecutor losing a case. Now, let me hasten to say, I thought John Landis was innocent. I thought he should have been acquitted. But the job would have been much more difficult if the prosecutor had simply played that film 2 or 3 times, shot with 4 different cameras, and called 2 or 3 people. Instead, she called 100 and some odd people who were on the set that night, and gave a shot at them. So since it's reckless homicide, and that involves knowing risk and predictability, we were able to cross-examine all those witnesses simply by asking them, well, you were there that night. That helicopter could have hit you. Yes. When you went there and you knew what was going to happen, you didn't think it was dangerous, did you? No, I didn't. And so that allowed us an opportunity to win the trial. The other thing that we did and learned greatly from focus groups. How many here have used focus groups when you're preparing your case? A good many, several anyway. Well, one of the bad things about the practice of law now is, in some ways, it's a lot like selling soap. You do community attitude surveys, you do focus groups, like a politician does, to see whether this line will work or that story will work. In the practice of law, you don't change your facts, and I don't mean that. But a focus group can, on occasion, really tell you what to emphasize. As an example, we had 3 or 4 focus groups, and we were losing badly in those focus groups. They weren't buying it. Before the last focus group, the jury consultant said, well, look, the parents of these kids were out there. John Landis brought them out. We said, yes. Well, the next focus group, we emphasized that John Landis had brought the parents out there at the scene. They're there throughout the scene. And that made a great impact on the jurors. It's an example of how sometimes lawyers focused on relevancy and a high sense of materiality and all of that, fail to remember that lay people may not think the same way. And that was a great example, and the jurors, after it's over, mentioned, well, Mr. Landis brought the parents out. It's the parents' job to take care of their children. Now, Jim and I never occurred to us because the parents were just off the boat from Vietnam, didn't understand English, couldn't speak English, and had no idea what was going to go on in that scene. But that made a difference to the parents. We did have the opportunity out there, fascinating opportunity. The prosecutor called an expert. I thought it was Jackie Coogan, Diane, but it was Jackie Cooper, Jimmy tells me, who testified as an expert director for the prosecution. Well, we knew they were going to do that, so Jim and I went around seeing if we could develop an expert director. And we interviewed John Huston. All of you here know who John Huston was. I'm sure the greatest director that ever was. Chinatown, Red Badge of Courage, all of that. We interviewed John Huston. We finally decided, although he liked John Landis and was willing to testify, we decided not to call him because at that time he was clearly dying. He was a huge smoker. He had an oxygen mask and an oxygen tent, and we just didn't think it would be productive for us to call him. We also interviewed Billy Wilder. People here hear of Billy Wilder. He directed Some Like It Hot and other movies. We interviewed him, and he was a lovely guy, and he said, I'd love to help John Landis. I'd be glad to testify, but I'm not qualified. I don't do action movies. He says, as a matter of fact, I even have a second director to do my sex scenes. So we finally abandoned that idea of getting a director as an expert, but we did learn there, number one, that focus groups can really help you, and number two, it is the worst overtried case I've ever seen, and a great mistake to do it. Anything you want to add, Jimmy? Yes, sir.
I just wondered if you called Mr. Landis as a witness.
What did you say?
Did you call Mr. Landis as a witness?
I did.
Testify?
I did. You know, let me tell you something. Most of the trials I have called the defendants as witnesses. It's out of vogue now, but if you have a defendant who has a clean record, I don't agree with the current wisdom that you don't call defendants to the stand. I just lost a case in Mississippi where I wish in retrospect, although the whole team thought it would be bad, I wish in retrospect we had called him to the stand. We didn't have much of a chance to begin with, and maybe we should have called him to the stand. Yes, we did call him to the stand. We did, because the case took 10 months, because of what the prosecutor did. We had enormous, and because the presiding judge was also handling his own docket, we might get off Thursday and not come back till Tuesday, that sort of thing. We had plenty of time to prepare John Landis. He started out resentful, bitter. He was, by the way, he was the first director who's ever been indicted criminally in the making of a film. Like Ford Motor Company, was the first company to be indicted for the design, manufacture, and sale of a product. But he started out being the worst witness I've ever seen. He ended up being maybe one of the best witnesses I've ever seen. We worked on him day after day after day. We put him in front of a camera. We videotaped him with us examining him. We videotaped him with others cross-examining him because we knew, and one thing is true, if you decide to put your witness, your defendant on the stand, your defendant on the stand, you can forget pretty much everything else that preceded it, because that's the ball game. And I guess that's the reason that the conventional wisdom is today, don't do it. You can precede the defendant by preparing the place for him, but immediately the intention is you live or die once you decide to put your defendant on the stand. So we took all that time. We spent a week of days anyway, didn't we, Jim? Putting him on, grilling him, videotaping him.
About 2 months.
About 2 months. It was forever. We just totally turned our attention to trying to make John Landis the best witness ever was. And boy, we came pretty close. Never lost his cool. The woman I called the Dragon Lady, cross-examined him for 7 days. Never lost his cool. Finally, when her last question, she said, "I guess Mr. Neal has asked you all those questions, hasn't he?" And John Landis very meekly said, "Yes, ma'am, and a whole lot more." So, we did put him on the stand, thank you. And when I defended Edward Evans, the then governor of Louisiana, I put him on the stand. I put a lot of defendants on the stand.
With Governor Edwards, why did you put him?
Because he was so bright. Well, first, everybody expected Edwards to take a stand. He was the sitting governor of the state. He'd been charged with what is in effect accepting bribes, and granting contracts based on bribes. Interesting little story. A big, heavy co-defendant, a Greek fellow named Gus Majalis. One day the media's all around, and Gus Majalis, a co-defendant and close friend of Edwin Edwards, up in front of the media and everybody one day said, "Jim, you know that Governor Edwards made me a millionaire?" All of I said, "Oh my God, why are you saying all the media around?" He laughed real big, as only Gus Majalis could do, and said, "Of course, I was a multimillionaire before I met him." Any event, everybody expected him to take his hand. He had testified all day long before the federal grand jury before I met him. So we had that baggage. He'd done a good job. Extremely bright. And next to Jimmy Hoffa, the most unforgettable man I've ever met. So we put him on the stand. He did a great job. Here again, the prosecutor cross-examined him for a long time. He did a wonderful job up at the last minute or two, but he was getting tired and confused. And the prosecutor asked him one time why he did a certain thing across the river. Of course, trying to say that was the straw that broke the camel's back. He said, "Well, that was the straw that drove the camel across the river." But
And I think you had said once that he was probably the most investigated.
oh yeah, he first in Congress, then a term, then governor, and finally he was caught, and he's in prison now. But he was a very bright guy, a very entertaining guy, and could he captivate the ladies? Oh man!
Now, it took you a month.
And Nixon, the doctors wouldn't let us bring him to court even if we wanted to, because he had phlebitis out in California, he said. So we had to figure out a way to lay the foundation for the tapes. One of the things that happened was a man by the name of Alexander Butterfield was a member of the White House at that time, and we solicited him, and he agreed to listen to all the tapes. He spent hundreds of hours listening to the tapes and agreed to testify. It's one reason that I thought, until it was ultimately disclosed I was wrong, that the Deep Throat was Alexander Butterfield, but it wasn't. But that's the way we laid the foundation for the tapes.
Were you surprised here recently when it finally came out who was
Yeah.
Deep Throat? Did
Yeah,
you ever
yeah. I
suspect?
thought it was Alex Butterfield. Yeah, I was surprised. Yeah. I just thought it was Alex Butterfield because he was in that White House. He had an opportunity to observe. Indeed, I think I'm right about this. If somebody tell me if I'm not right, wasn't when Fred Thompson brought out in the Senate hearings, he had on the stand when he either beautifully or inadvertently or whatever asked Butterfield, wasn't Butterfield the witness?
Yes.
Butterfield was on the stand, and Fred asked the question, was there any taping done in the White House? And Alex Butterfield said, yes, there was. And that exposed the White House taping system. So,
Just by chance or?
I don't know, maybe Fred knew something. I haven't talked to him about it, but at least he was the trigger of it.
Now, while you were doing the Watergate case, you had a private practice back here in Nashville.
I had to get out. Unlike this guy, who's the latest prosecutor that took after
Ken Starr.
Ken Starr. Ken Starr got a big contract. I literally had to withdraw from the firm, and I did. And Aubrey and the firm going while I was in Watergate, and for which I'm eternally grateful.
And I assume you didn't have a big pay increase when you went to Washington.
I hardly lived. Hardly lived. There was one other issue that was interesting about Watergate, and that is John Dean. I don't know how many of you remember John Dean, but John Dean was Nixon's White House counsel, and he was the one on one of the tapes that you can hear saying to Nixon, "There's a cancer growing on the presidency." Well, I was going to prosecute John Dean, but I wanted to try to get him as a witness. But the Senate Watergate Committee was calling John Dean, and we're going to immunize him. So if you all are familiar, anybody practiced criminal law, Aubrey, some of the people here, Hal will know, what you get is use and derivative use immunity. If the Senate immunized Dean, I couldn't use his testimony or anything remotely derived from his testimony to prosecute John Dean. Well, it's very hard to show that nothing in your case was derived from somehow that immunized testimony. So what I did was I bundled up boxes. I had the office bundle up boxes of transcripts and everything else I had and take them down and take them to the clerk of the United States District Court in Washington, D.C., and have them label them and give me a receipt before Dean testified. Now, as it turned out, I finally, at 3 o'clock one morning, got Dean to agree to accept a plea to one count and to testify for us. Dean went to prison. I was certain he was going to prison. He went to prison, but then he testified for us in the Watergate case, and was still one of the greatest witnesses I've ever seen. Greatest recall. But we got through that.
Another element of the Watergate case, you had some great testimony to use to impeach the witnesses from their Senate testimony, correct?
Oh, yeah. Haldeman and Ehrlichman and Mitchell all refused immunity and testified before the Senate Select Committee, and there I've got it, Cardinal Richelieu says, give me 6 lines written by the most honest of men, and I'll find something there to hang him. Well, I had volumes of their testimony and could cross-examine them on that testimony.
Now, your closing argument in that case has been studied and is really well known. Tell us a little bit about your closing. How do you close?
It was long. It was 3 hours long, more than 3 hours long. I didn't think I could take that long, but I tried to make a story out of what was happening, and I used some flowery expressions about. Can you imagine? Can you imagine comparing the White House when Lincoln was saying with malice towards none, with charity for all, with Richard Nixon saying, let's give them an hors d'oeuvre, and maybe they won't come back for the main course. Some of those. But they were great people to caricature. We had this guy, Fred LaRue, who was one of the officials of the committee to reelect the president. Everybody called him Creep. Well, Fred LaRue was one of the people who received the cash to go pay the burglars. Well, when they went to Fred LaRue put on gloves to take the money. And so you can imagine the fun I had with Fred LaRue on the stand when I'm saying, now, Mr. LaRue, the defendants contend that this was for charitable purposes. Why did you use gloves, Mr. LaRue? So that case was shooting fish in a barrel, as far as that trying is concerned.
What do you think the big rules, or what do we learn out of the Watergate case?
Well, you know, after Iran-Contra and various other things that happened that after, I'm not sure that we've learned a lot. Laws were passed. One of the laws was the campaign finance. Some of that's gone now. The Special Prosecutors Act came out of that. That's gone now. And I'm not sure over a period of time you learn much. What we hoped, what was learned in some sense was that the system really works, even if you have a president of the United States as a target. And you know, in the Watergate case, Nixon was named by the grand jury in a 19-0 vote as an unindicted co-conspirator. And Nixon would have been prosecuted had he not been pardoned, even though I didn't think we should prosecute him. So I think a sanguine way to look at it is the system works. The White House horrors, as they referred to, not only the cover-up, but the pillaging of the psychiatrist's office, the wiretapping of newsmen, these things were uncovered and handled. And we did it in much shorter time than Fitzpatrick took to indict Scooter Libby. But something like 29 people, we convicted something like 29 people is also what we did.
What was your relationship with Judge Sirica?
Great relationship with Judge Sirica. He and I sang from the same hymn book. He was a great old fellow. He was constantly under attack by a man named John Wilson. Sirica was 73 years old at the time of the case. John Wilson, who represented H.R. Haldeman, was 73. And John Wilson was trying to goad Sirica into reversible error. And every time Sirica would rule, mostly in my favor, John Wilson stand up and say, I've got another one, Judge, for my error bag. One day when the jury was out, and this made more headlines than most anything I did. The jury was out, and Wilson did another one of those, Judge, I got another one, error for my error bag. And I said something you're all familiar with, but never heard of it in Washington and other places. I said, Judge, John Wilson's error bag reminds me of what we call in Tennessee a 30 bag, 2 pounds of manure in a 1 pound bag. And it made headlines. But I got along well with Judge Sirica, and his rulings were mainly in my favor, but he was affirmed on appeal.
Well, you mentioned the Southern expression. How has being from the South affected your career? Has it helped you when you've gone to other parts of the country, or has it hurt you, or?
Yeah, let me tell you, first place, there are a lot of Southerners around the country. When Jim and I are out defending the director, John Landis, in Twilight Zone case, we learned that many of the jurors were originally from Alabama, Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, so Southerners everywhere. Second, it doesn't hurt to have a draw. People think you're slow and good old boy, and you don't hesitate to use that. So no, I never found. I found if anything at all, it's an advantage.
After this, you came back to Nashville.
Yep.
And I guess your next big case was Indiana versus Ford Motor Company, the Pinto case.
Yes, it was. That case, the accident was in August of '78. The trial was from January of '80 to March of '80. It was in Winnemac, Indiana, a little town in northern Indiana. The accident, and I'll just tell you one anecdote about this. The accident occurred between Elkhart, where the girls lived, and Goshen, Indiana. And three little girls were in a '73 Pinto on their way to a church supper from Elkhart to Goshen, Indiana. And they were hit in the rear by a 1972 Chevrolet van where the driver admittedly was going 50 miles an hour. Two bizarre things happened in this case. One was that the vehicle, they never reached Goshen, they never got to church, but the vehicle was turned around, headed back towards Elkhart, and when it was hit in the rear. The prosecutor, Michael A. Cosentino, paid no attention to that fact for some reason. But Aubrey and I couldn't get it out of our minds. Why was that vehicle turned around, never reaching Winnemac? And Aubrey did a massively beautiful job on this. I've got a story that we worried about this, but so, by the way, I should added this to my enduring and unchangeable things, having unlimited resources. Helps you be a great trial lawyer or a good one. We had unlimited resources. It would have literally killed Ford Motor Company to be declared a murderer. So we decided to interview anybody who had any connection, however remote, with this accident, wherever they was. And eventually, Aubrey interviewed a woman by the name of Wanda Lumpkin, who was an emergency room nurse at the Elkhart General Hospital, where these three burned girls were taken before they died. And Aubrey set out to find Wanda Lumpkin, having no idea where Wanda Lumpkin was. She was no longer a nurse in that area, but having no idea where she was. And I don't know how he did it, how he found it, but he found out that she was doing missionary work in Costa Rica. Aubrey somehow got on the phone, right, Aubrey? Is it phone or did you go down? On both? Okay. He found Wanda Lumpkin, and she mentioned that she made a passing reference to a born-again black orderly who had spent time with one of the little girls before she died. And so then Aubrey, and I think maybe John Ross or Jim Thomas or somebody, set out to find out this little black orderly. We had no idea what he would do. All we know is what we told you. They found him in hunting season in Upper Michigan, And his name, I'll never forget, was Levi Woodard. And he was a little black orderly. And they interviewed him. Aubrey and all of them interviewed him and then told me what they got. And here is the story. Remember, the Pinto had turned around. And I've got to add one thing to it. There were 10 eyewitnesses to this accident. Those eyewitnesses said that the closing speed, and you know what the closing speed is, the differential speed between if a vehicle's moving this way and another moving that way. It's the differential in the speed, that the closing speed of these vehicles were 10 to 20 miles an hour, that the Pinto was moving at about 30 to 40 miles an hour, and we knew the van was going 50. That was clear. Van was going 50. So the Pinto was going 30 to 40 miles an hour when it was hit. And that's what we knew according to the eyewitnesses. Aubrey went to Upper Michigan, found, now I'm flashing back to Levi Woodard, found Levi Woodard. We brought him in. He tells the story. Yes, I was, this little girl, Irvich, who was dying, wanted to know if, does anybody here, she asked, does anybody, she's 18 years old, does anybody here know Jesus? Can anyone say Bible verses? This young boy was a Seventh-day Adventist. He went in with her, he held her burned hand, he talked to her, and she told him what happened. They were traveling from Elkhart to Goshen. They stopped up and filled a little Pinto with gasoline. They drove off, and they were driving off. One of the girls noticed that the gasoline cap had rolled across the road. They had put it on top of the Pinto, and it had come off and rolled across the highway. They turned, according to her story, turned and pulled up to the gasoline cap, and stopped. And the Pinto was stopped when the crash occurred, meaning the closing speed was 50 miles an hour, not what the 10 eyewitnesses said. So the prosecutor started to cross-examine Levi Woodard on the ground that this was a fabrication story. And as all of you know, to rebut recent fabrication, you can put on a prior consistent statement. So we stood up and said, Your Honor, if the prosecutor continues the statement, we've got a yellow bus outside. We will bring every participant at the church, where the week after this happened, Levi Woodard had gotten up and witnessed to the congregation about what this happened to this little girl. So that stopped the cross-examination on recent fabrication. We knew that if the closing speed was 50 miles an hour, and our scientific people had told us that 10 to 20 miles an hour can't be right. There's too much crush, static and dynamic, to have that kind of a low closing speed. So when we stopped the Pinto and showed there was a closing speed of 50 miles an hour, we bought every 73 subcompact you could find in the country, all of them, from every automobile manufacturer. We bought every 72 Chevrolet van we could find. We took them on the proving grounds where you can micrometers of judgment second. We crashed any number of 72 Chevrolet vans into 73 subcompacts, including a 73 Pinto, because our experts said all of them will destroy the rear end gas tank. It'll rupture on everyone at that speed. And so basically our defense came, and they did. We crashed them all. We showed the crash films in the trial, and our defense was, The Pinto may not be worth a shit, but it's as good as any other 73 subcontract at the time, compact at the time. So that's that.
And it worked. I understand this was a tiny little town,
Yeah.
and you had some interesting experiences getting there. I think you had an interesting experience flying into a small airport.
Oh, Ford was good enough to provide us with a plane and a pilot and allow us to fly back and forth to Nashville. The plane was rickety and the pilot was untrained, and so we had some interesting experiences flying back and forth.
And there was a incident where you and Mr. Harwell got to ride in the back of a pickup, I believe, into town?
Yeah, all those things. So much for that.
Okay.
There's a time for a break?
Yes, it is.
All right.
We're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back to some other cases.
Okay.